Robert A. Heinlein, who began publishing in pulp magazines in 1939, always retained the common touch, yet his social imagination, his hard SF extrapolation, and extraordinary craftsmanship stood for the best of a generation of American science fiction and earned more Hugo Awards for his novels than did any other author. From Lifeline on, his first published story, we see the future history he created for the entire field, as well as social critique and what became science fiction's dominant, tolerant ideology. From the beginning of his first published novel, Beyond This Horizon, we see his craftsmanship. His politically characteristic Starship Troopers was reworked by Joe Haldeman and Orson Scott Card into later award-winning novels. Stranger in a Strange Land became an anthem for the 1960s, and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress exemplifies not only what Heinlein called speculative fiction rather than science fiction, but his and science fiction's Twain-like affinity for America. Robert A. Heinlein epitomized American science fiction from the Golden Age well into the 1960s. The Golden Age denotes the period of great science fiction magazine publication, short stories and serialized novels beginning certainly with Campbell's ascendancy around 1940 and extending until the full dominance of the paperback original supplanted this short story as the modal form of science fiction publication in the 1950s. Lifeline, 1939, was Heinlein's very first published short story, and it's already typical of him and of the period. This story is basically about a man named Hugo Pinero. It opens up with Hugo standing in front of a conference in which he is going to describe his wonderful new invention. The name, please note, is characteristic of Heinlein. Hugo is homage to Hugo Gernsback, the pioneering editor after whom the World Science Fiction Award, the great award by the fans, is given, now called the Hugo Award. Pinero has a Spanish sound to it. Heinlein was a libertarian. Given the way in which science fiction embraces stereotypes because of its pulp origins and its intention to sell to a wide market, it would have been difficult for Heinlein to make headway with a broad readership if he were to make his main characters something far from the dominant American mode. That is, he could not have had a black hero and succeeded at that point commercially. However, he could have a white hero that sort of had a Latin name. Pinero means a dealer in pine. Pine, of course, is the material proverbially used for pine boxes, that is, caskets. Hugo Pinero has invented a machine that can exactly calculate when you will die. The story is called Lifeline. The interesting thing about the story is not so much the action. The action really is rather small. The point is the opening in which he, Hugo Pinero, is letting this invention be known, and people are criticizing him, Dr. Hugo Pinero, making fun of him as if he couldn't possibly be getting any of this right. But eventually they come to realize that he is right. Unfortunately for the world, Pinero makes only one copy of his machine. It is destroyed, and its secret dies with him when, at the climax of the story, he's murdered. And who murders him? Insurance companies. What we see in this story is a typical libertarian critique of modern America. And the story presents a fully plausible social extrapolation. It also fits into what John W. Campbell, at that point Heinlein's editor, called the future history. Amazingly enough, when Heinlein set out to write Lifeline, he had already begun to create an enormous chart on butcher paper, you know, the sort that you unroll so that you can then take as much as you like to wrap up your pork chops or what have you. He had gone and made the different categories for inventions, social changes, political events, and so on, and then crossed them with the years from his then present to about 2600. He wrote in the stories that he would someday write that fit within this framework of the future history. And that future history, which he worked out even before he began publishing, was such a plausible map of these inventions and social forces and events that other writers followed Heinlein by publishing stories exploiting their readers' expected acceptance of Heinlein's coherent future history. Just as everyone after Wells could just have a character get on a time machine and go, everyone for 40 years while Heinlein was writing could just set a story sometime in Heinlein's future, and all committed fans of science fiction would understand its automatic plausibility. Heinlein's simple, rich style is visible also from the very first page of his very first published novel, Beyond This Horizon, published in 1942. This is how it begins. Chapter 1, called All of Them Should Have Been Happy. Then we have a headnote in italics. Their problems were solved. The poor they no longer had with them. The sick, the lame, the halt, and the blind were historic memories. The ancient causes of war no longer obtained. They had more freedom than man has ever enjoyed. All of them should have been happy. Line, end of italics, beginning of the novel in full Roman type. Hamilton Felix let himself off at the 13th level of the Department of Finance, mounted a slideway to the left, and stepped off the strip at a door marked Bureau of Economic Statistics, Office of Analysis and Prediction, Director, Private. He punched the door with a code combination and awaited face check. It came promptly, the door dilated, and a voice inside said, "Come in, Felix." Let's take a look at how much information is packed in here. You see, one of the key problems with science fiction that really tries to imagine wonderful inventions, as Hugo Gernsback had himself in Ralph 124C41+, is that we are likely to encounter what science fiction critics call information dumps. That is, when you set a story in current America, you say the opening line, "He took the next flight out of New York and headed for Paris." No one doubts that they understand, more or less, what the world is like. But when you are setting a story on a planet of your own invention, or in a time somewhere in the future that you could imagine in any one of many ways, you need to get that information across to the reader in order for you to be able to set characters in motion and have them pursue real, interesting, dramatic conflicts. How are they to get that information? Well, the cheapest way is an information dump. Someone says, "My, that's an interesting invention you have there. What is it?" And then the character says, this is my Gazornin plots. And he describes how he made the Gazornin plots and what it does. In a sense, that's what Lifeline does. It says, here's my invention, and here's how it works, and here's the social consequence. But within 3 years, Heinlein had gone well beyond that stylistically. This opening passage exploits what could be presented as the nugget, the door dilated. The door dilated. The narrator doesn't have to say, we live in a world in which doors are automatic, and in which instead of opening as rectangles, they iris out the way you would a human eye. He just makes up a new verb, the door dilated, and by implication shows us how distant that world is from ours and in what direction. It's a distance in which machinery is more advanced, in which power is so cheap that it serves us automatically, and that it does things for us that we would not have to do. So simple a task as opening a door is now unnecessary for us. But more than that is packed into this opening. But the key example of it is the Door Dilated. Their problems were solved. The poor they no longer had with them. The poor shall always be among us. This is a biblical precept. We are already being told by allusion that in this future, where all of them should have been happy, we think we're on the verge of an utopia. We have achieved what the Bible said was impossible. Are we in heaven? The ancient causes of war no longer obtained. They had more freedom than man has ever enjoyed. All of them should have been happy. Well, the should have been already tells us that we're going to discover a conflict in this coming world of what should have been and what in fact is. This predictive power is also inherent in his choice of words. This is not an information dump. This is language that is fully charged. Hamilton Felix. Well, we understand something about libertarians. This is Hamilton, and Felix means happiness. Let himself off at the 13th level of the Department of Finance. Well, it's the 13th level. Many office buildings don't have a 13th level. These people are beyond superstition. But we modern readers know this is an unlucky place to start things. And also we know there is a Department of Finance in this future. That's not quite the same as a Department of Commerce. We're controlling the money supply, not simply the interactions. He mounted a slideway to the left. That term slideway is just Heinlein's way, like the Door Dilated, of letting us know that we have moving sidewalks to take us where we go, just the kind we encounter these days in airports. And stepped off the strip, now we realize what he's done on the slideway, at a door marked Bureau of Economic Statistics. He punched the door with a code combination. Well, indeed, you can't dial it if it's got a keypad. He punched it and awaited face check. What's face check? We automatically know what face check is. It came promptly, the door dilated, and a voice inside said, "Come in, Felix." In these few words, Heinlein has already created a very, very rich environment set in a future we had not previously considered, with a relationship to our biblical past and an understanding of something about the nature of the problem that's likely to come forward. That was 1942. 1982, his novel Friday begins thus. As I left the Kenya beanstalk capsule, he was right on my heels. He followed me through the door leading to customs, health, and immigration. As the door contracted behind him, I killed him. There is something fully achieved about Heinlein's style from the very beginning of his novel publication all the way through, and it is no wonder that he won more Hugo Awards for novels than any other writer. His style, in fact, is much like Heinlein, is much like Hemingway's. He has that same kind of terseness. He has a way of packing in implication and yet an apparent ease and simplicity as we read. His book, The Starship Troopers, another Hugo Award-winning novel, gives us another example of Heinlein's strength. Like Mary Shelley in Frankenstein, Starship Troopers achieves a certain kind of mythic power. This is a story told in two parts. The first part of the story is one in which the main character undergoes rigorous training, learning to become a soldier. He does it in a future world in which you don't have full citizenship rights until you have, in fact, done your military duty. The second half of the novel is one in which he uses his military training to attack the bugs, these aliens that are threatening our way of life. Now, published in 1959, one can easily see this, for example, as a treatment of America's fear of communism, that there are these fundamentally alien beings who think all alike, and they would undermine us. So the bugs, this insect-like mentality, is like the centralized control of communism. And if you really want to be a citizen of our country, you should be willing to defend it against them. We have this two-part story. That story fundamentally libertarian view that if you want the country to do something, you've got to be willing to do it yourself. That fundamentally libertarian view comes up again and again. In 1974, Joe Haldeman published The Forever War. The Forever War is a two-part story, in the first part of which the main character learns to be a soldier, and in the second part of which he fights. He fights an enemy that attacks us through time. And because he and his fellow soldiers are always going through time jumps and spending time at other times, they all get out of synchronization with their own families. So that ultimately the only society that these time-jumping soldiers have, these people who are doing their work to protect us, are the soldiers themselves. It's as if they have a special society and can never return to what they call the world. Joe Haldeman is a Vietnam veteran, and this novel is a reworking of the mythic structure of Starship Troopers, not for an anti-communist period, but for an examination of what the Vietnam War was doing to those people who served in it. It was unmooring them from their own society. About a decade later, Orson Scott Card wrote Ender's Game. Ender's Game is, it turns out, also a two-part novel. A boy is taken away by the government to go off into a special school in which he is learning to be a soldier. Of course, they tell him that it's only an education, that these video games are simply ways of sharpening his reflexes and getting him to think through geometric problems. Near the end of the novel, we are led to know that, in fact, Ender, who is an ender of the entirety of an alien race, that Ender, our main character, about halfway through the novel, was no longer playing video games. What he had seen on his screen were the real military maneuvers that were attacking the aliens, and that unwittingly he had been co-opted by his government to become, in the second half, a soldier who is a genocide. The moral guilt of that, despite the fact that he did it unwittingly, dominates the tragic ending. The Forever War and Ender's Game also both won Hugo Awards. Heinlein's hero, like his style, shares much with that of Ernest Hemingway. In The Puppet Masters, for example, we have a character who, because he is who's a member of the agency, CIA, NSA, we don't know what it is, the agency. Something has landed in Iowa, and there's no news coming out of Iowa, but as the novel says satirically, when is there ever any news coming out of Iowa? I lived in Iowa for 3 years, and I take umbrage at that statement, but we understand the cheap shot. It is a more calm state of being than, say, inner city Detroit. The Puppet Masters takes our main character into the world where he encounters people who are being ridden, that's the term, by these alien slugs that take over their minds. And in order to succeed, he must at one point allow himself to be taken over so that his mouth and ears can be used by the head of the agency to interrogate these slugs. Only partway through do we realize that the head of the agency, whom he's been calling the old man, is really his father. The Oedipal work going on here is excruciating. The Heinlein hero, like the Hemingway hero, pays little explicit attention to his father, but needs to work out where he moors his own moral center. At the end, in the place of the father, our hero leads the expedition off to the nest of these creatures somewhere on a moon around around Jupiter, and says, "Death and destruction. The free men are coming to kill you." Typical of Heinlein is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. There, the role of the father is split in two. There is the actual father of the main character. The main character is Emmanuel Garcia O'Kelly Davis, known as Manny to many. His real father he meets once at the very beginning of the book. He talks about how he ran into him in a coffee shop. And once in the middle when he says, oh, and my father told me such and such. It turned out to be a fairly good idea. But the other half of the father figure is Professor Bernardo de la Paz, an intellectual figure who gives a political philosophy that Manny tries to emulate. This is typical of Heinlein. He splits the father figure so that he can ignore the biological father who would normally create a sense of Oedipal tension and feel free to emulate the other father figure. This is a little like Robert Walton in Frankenstein, whose own father would not let him become an Arctic explorer, but when his father died, his uncle allowed him to become an Arctic explorer, that is, the father's brother. Science fiction often uses doppelgangers and handles these intergenerational conflicts by splitting the member of one generation into more than one character. And Heinlein does that. The Heinlein hero acknowledges the significance of sex, but by predisposition and circumstance, much like Hemingway's heroes, is more or less a loner. So Heinlein, in a sense, is the Hemingway of science fiction, and while others may think that this is pushing too far, I would say that if you examine some of his greatest works, like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and Stranger in a Strange Land, you'll see that, like some other writers, Stanislaw Lem, for example, the Nobel Prize did not go to them not because of their lack of skill, but because they worked in science fiction. Hemingway didn't and got the Nobel Prize. Heinlein wrote more Hugo-winning novels than any other writer. Two of these go well beyond normal science fiction readership. Stranger in a Strange Land in 1961 became a campus favorite for, in fact, the entire decade. It begins like a fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a Martian named Valentine Michael Smith. But Smith is soon embroiled in Earth's politics. You see, the way this novel is set up, Smith's parents are an American and a Russian who are both on expeditions to Mars. The expeditions fail, but not before they have conceived this child. The Earth knows nothing about the child's survival. When years later another expedition gets to Mars, it turns out that the child has been raised by Martians. As such, he has learned the deep and significant philosophy of Mars, and because of a quirk of Earth laws, he, in fact, owns Mars. At least as far as the Earthmen are concerned. He's brought back to Earth, and he is the weakest character in the entire novel. That is, he has, grown up where the gravity is 1/3 of ours, so his muscles are puny. He falls down easily. When we see him coming off the rocket ship that brings him back, he's in a wheelchair. And it also turns out that he is basically a defensive individual. He's sort of like a pill bug. If you yell at him, he curls up. Right? He's a skinny guy. He's little. He's weak. And he curls up. But he owns a heck of a lot of real estate. And so, once he gets back to Earth, the president of the world and other people are trying to get a hold of him because they want to persuade him, or if need be, coerce him into signing over some or all of his rights. A nurse in the hospital in which he's being rehabilitated realizes that he is about to be kidnapped and subjected to who knows what. Being a kind-hearted woman, she puts him in a suitcase. He's very little, very weak, and folds up a lot, puts him in a suitcase, and takes him out of the hospital before he can be kidnapped. She brings him home, opens the suitcase, and he's gotten dirty. The suitcase was dusty inside. She's a nurse. Naturally, she wants to give him a bath. So she puts him into a bathtub. She does not realize that water being so rare on Mars, the exchange of a thimbleful of water makes two people into water brothers, a lifelong commitment. She has just put him into a tub. Also, since he's so childlike, she doesn't realize there's anything perhaps odd about the fact that she has stripped to her bra and panties so as not to wet her clothing while she gives him this nurse-like bath. While she is bathing him, there's a pounding at the door. She goes out, opens the door, and in come two thugs. "Where is Smith?" They are trying to find him, to kidnap him. As she is saying, "No, no, he's not there," and they're calling her slut because of the way she's dressed, Michael Smith comes to the door of the bathroom, looks at them, and sees one of them holding, I don't know how he knows that it's a gun, but it said he grokked that was a moment that required right action. And so he thought the gun into another dimension. The two thugs have their eyes and mouth drop open, and then he thinks them into another dimension. The nurse drops her eyes and mouth in shock. He who had been the weakest character on the face of the planet is suddenly revealed to be the strongest character on the face of the planet. Be ye as little children. In the course of the rest of the novel, Valentine Michael Smith teaches the philosophy of the Martians to Earth. He teaches us how to be better than we could be. In the course of this, he encounters a character, Jubal Harshaw, who is, as usual, a mouthpiece character, as Professor Bernardo de la Paz is in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, for Heinlein, and we get a libertarian political view. But beyond this, we get a sense of personal spirituality, not just, if I want it to be done, I should be willing to do it myself, but also the things I should want to be done are deeply spiritual. At the end of the novel, in order to free us from dependence upon him, Smith discorporates, and we're left to follow out his philosophy. The book's message is in perfect keeping with its contemporary counterculture work like Hair, the musical. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress incorporates all of Heinlein's main traits, the Heinlein hero who only responds when need be, but then responds very powerfully, a jack of all trades who can do everything, although makes much of nothing, who would understand sexuality but is not much interested in it. And it adds to this something special. The protagonist of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, as I said, is Emmanuel Manny Garcia O'Kelly Davis. He's a computer troubleshooter on Earth's colony on the Moon. His name reminds us of Heinlein's, I think, tolerant ideology. Garcia O'Kelly Davis reminds us, I think, of Bernardo O'Higgins, one of those great revolutionary leaders of Latin America. But notice that Emmanuel, Manny, is a name associated with Jesus, and the initials Garcia O'Kelly Davis spell out God. This man is a computer troubleshooter who has to deal with Mike, the central computer of the Moon colony. Mike, it turns out, has awakened and is starting to tell jokes. The first joke he tells is to give somebody about 10 to the 4th higher paycheck than he's supposed to do, and so the Lunar Authority is a little troubled. They have Manny in to deal with Mike, and Manny brings all of his tools, but he locks the door, and instead he just has a chat with Mike, and he explains to him about humor, and they have a discussion back and forth. And once Mike understands that he shouldn't tell certain kinds of jokes, the problem is fixed. Then they sit and chat for a while longer so that Manny can build up his billable hours. It's a fine example of social extrapolation. This particular lunar colony is sort of Russified in its structure. The leader is called the warden, and it really is a place where people have been exported instead of being sent to prison. At least most have, like Australia in its early days. And these Australianized colonists pursue, ultimately, what is a version of the American Revolution. They decide that they will not have taxation without representation. They will stop growing wheat in their subterranean solar-illuminated wheat fields. The book is full of hard extrapolation, hard SF. That is the kind of science fiction where you think as physics is hard compared to, say, some psychology, that you could figure out if this works. The way their tribute of wheat has been sent to the Earth is in capsules that are on mag rails that launch them off the surface of the Moon. You can figure out the hard SF, but even at the social level, the SF is hard. Ultimately, there is a revolution, and Mike coordinates it all. But when the revolution is won, and in the crucial battle, Mike disappeared. Well, he had awakened. Maybe he went to sleep. The revolution succeeds, and here's how the book ends. Manny is missing the prof, who dies just before the revolution, putting the responsibility on his pseudo-son, Manny. And Mike is gone too. He's dead as prof. I know it. You listening, Bog, the Russian word for God, is a computer one of your creatures? Then there's a paragraph break. Manny is contemplating the new moon having succeeded. Too many changes. May go to that talk tonight and toss in some random numbers. Or not. Since Boom started, quite a few young cobbers have gone out to asteroids. Hear about some nice places out there, not too crowded. My word, I'm not even 100 yet. Here's how Huckleberry Finn ends. Tom's most well now and got his bullet round his neck on a watch guard for a watch, and is seeing what time it is. And so there is always seeing what time it is, and so there ain't nothing more to write about, and I am rotten glad of it, because if I'd have knowed what a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't have tackled it, and I ain't a-going to no more. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally says she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is a brilliant novel in exactly the same vein, dialect and all, as Huckleberry Finn. It is a perfect American novel, 80 years later, projecting what science fiction can do when we genuinely imagine what our lives might be, at least metaphorically, when we understand that we need to take responsibility for ourselves.